Hi, everyone. This is Karen Hurd, and tonight we're going to be talking about trauma and the way it steals your life and how you can get your life back and return to joy. So I'm going to go right to my slides right now. I want to thank you so much for joining me, and this is an exclusive to the Woman Wise Healthy Living group. So if you have a friend that could benefit by this, feel free to add them to the group with their permission, tag them in this video, and share with them some hope and some tools that will make their life a lot better and help them to get their life back. Let's get started, shall we? Go ahead and share my screen. All right. So returning to joy, healing from trauma. We're going to be talking about a number of things tonight. This is something that's near and dear to my heart. I was diagnosed twice in my life as having post-traumatic stress syndrome, or PTSD, and came out of a childhood that was fraught with a lot of stuff. And then, like a lot of traumatized people, I made some really bad decisions in my life that compounded that trauma. And that is one of the things we'll talk a little bit about, the trauma, the loop that there can be, and then the seemingly endless cycle. So let's talk for a minute about the difference between trauma versus grief, because you will have grief inside trauma and they will share some similarities, but there's some distinctions. And that's always helpful, I think, to have the correct label for things. I often feel like when we have the appropriate thing to the appropriate identification, then we have a way to know what to do and how to do it. So trauma is any event or experience that overwhelms an individual's emotional and relational capacity to process the experience. And like, what the heck does that mean? That means your brain literally can't process what's happening. It's more than just a temporary shock. Your brain has a lot of responses. The executive function shuts down. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. We'll talk about how the brain gets overwhelmed and can't process what's happening, and that's part of what distinguishes trauma. Trauma is not universal in that two people can go through maybe the experience of a house fire and one be very traumatized and the other one grieve but be resilient and move forward. And that is one of the things I know there's research into trying to find out what makes one person resilient and the other person traumatized out of similar events. There are two basic types of trauma. One is neglect. That's called type A, and that's a neglect. The example would be a child whose parents took care of their physical needs, but not any of their emotional needs. Abandonment. So that wasn't an event like, say, a crime per se, but you were left alone. That causes a deep, deep trauma, by the way. Chronic illness. You might see this with people who have chronic or unmanageable pain, for example. They can be traumatized by that. A lack of affection, right? Failure to thrive. We see that with orphans. That's actually a form of trauma. And those are deeply traumatic. They impair development, although sometimes people that have come through those, because there wasn't a specific event, because there wasn't maybe a violent event, they don't feel like they've been traumatized, and yet they have all the hallmarks of trauma. Type B trauma is more an event. Usually it's unusual or unexpected. Like a house fire. We've heard of people having those, but not everybody experiences a house fire. Everybody does experience the death of a grandparent, or a loved one, because death is there. How that death happens, of course, can be more traumatic. But disaster, crime, abuse, combat, death of a child, it's usually something out of someone's control. And trauma leading to PTSD is actually better understood as a syndrome. It means a collection of events. PTSD is actually closer to a form of brain injury as opposed to merely an emotional state. Grief from a normal experience, like I mentioned a moment ago, death of a loved one, loss of a job, health issues, those have sadness, loss, maybe a sense of powerlessness, but there's also a sense of continuum. And grief is primarily emotional. And again, remember, PTSD is closer to a brain injury. Trauma does include grief. Grief can be deep and lasting, but it's not a brain injury, and that's one of the distinction. But many of the tools that somebody uses to heal from trauma, let me see if I got to invite somebody here. Okay. To heal from trauma, hey, Becky, is very, very similar. All right. So let's talk. Let's go there. I'm just, do you guys think I need a new computer? Maybe I do. Okay, so what is trauma? Trauma is really, there's a sense of being surreal, especially if it's a type B trauma. There's a change in reality and sense of safety. I think for a lot of us, we can imagine perhaps a victim of crime, somebody who's had their house burglarized, can be traumatized. They no longer feel safe in the very place they should feel the safest. There are biochemical changes in the brain, some of which can be very long lasting. There's physiological changes in the brain and in the body. The brain physically looks different after trauma. The body literally holds on to trauma because we're holistic beings, right? We are whole beings. There's changes in perception of danger and fear. That's more like anxiety. So the traumatized person is a much more fearful person and perhaps fearful of many more things than somebody who's merely grieving. It impacts memory and impairs cognitive function and decision-making. Those are related. We talked a moment ago about the brain in a traumatic event in particular can't process it. Somebody's in a very, very severe car accident. They can't process what happened, and what the brain will literally do in an effort to try to protect itself and deal with this overwhelming thing. The executive function literally shuts down in brain scans. People literally, they can see the front part of the brain literally get a little flatter. And then the memory is disjointed and stored. Think about the way a squirrel stores nuts. It's just kind of random. Bits of the memory are stored all over. And that's why a traumatized person often cannot put together a linear story. They can't say this and this and this. They may remember it disjointedly. They might remember a smell or a sight or a sense or a feeling, or yes, the clock was over here, bits and pieces of it. And especially in a crime situation, could be accused of lying because they cannot put together this linear story. And I was sharing this with an attorney, and I said, you know, you need to be aware of this when you're in court if somebody's been traumatized. And he had no idea. They don't teach that in law school. All right. It does change behavior. We'll talk a little bit how in just a moment. It impacts relationship, and this is very key, a sense of connection. Somebody who is grieving may want to be alone, kind of feels a little bit separate, but it is much more intense in the trauma experience. It impacts human development and maturity. You see this especially in people who are addicted to a behavior or a substance. They say, oh, they act like they're 5 years old. Right, that's probably about when the trauma happened. And it's literally a type of arrested emotional development. The source of trauma can differ. So people who've been traumatized often feel that nobody can quite understand the trauma that they've been in. That's part of that sense of not being connected. But the effects are often the same. How they may play it out might be the same. And by play it out, I mean go through the trauma itself. All right, so let's talk about, I want to make sure here. There we go. I'm just gonna make sure they're there. Okay, we did that. All right, trauma and PTSD. 1 out of 10 women experience PTSD, and that can come from sexual assault, childhood sexual assault, abuse, domestic violence, crime. 4 out of 100 men, so it's about 4% of men. So all total, you're looking at in Americans, 7 to 8 million Americans at any one time have some form of diagnosed PTSD, and the diagnosis has changed. It used to be believed that in order to have a diagnosis of PTSD, you had to have believed that your life was physically threatened. They've expanded that and realized that the idea of the sense of impending immediate death There's not, well, that can cause trauma, certainly. That is not the only way a person can be traumatized. Addiction is actually now being understood as a response to trauma, violent situations, or natural disasters. The increase in alcoholism, because alcohol is so readily available, it really spikes after a natural disaster. So let's talk about how people cope with trauma. There are similar behaviors among men and women, but women are more likely to use avoidance, share feelings, and talk about it, because women are more verbal overall. Men are much more likely to use anger and isolate, and probably be a little bit more violent. Addiction, 25 to 75% of childhood abuse survivors develop alcohol abuse problems. And why alcohol? Probably just happens to because it's readily available. Up to 33% of natural disaster survivors can develop alcohol abuse problems. You see that response to trauma, right? Again, it's the brain trying to cope with an overwhelming circumstance. Addictive behaviors are an attempt to numb and interrupt the brain cycle of trauma. I was just talking to somebody the other day in a Facebook group, and she was having a major panic attack. And I told her that your brain is looping through. And part of addiction is a negative compounding response to trying to break that loop. So we're going to talk about some positive ways to break it. Codependency, especially in spouses, partners, or close family members of addicts, is probably more an attempt to manage trauma than it's actually necessarily emotionally manipulative. And because if you look at what a lot of codependent behaviors are, it's really somebody trying to protect themselves in a world that has proven itself to be completely unreliable, unpredictable, and dangerous. So, but even codependency is a form of resilience. And we are resilient. The problem is we don't know how to heal. Have you ever thought to yourself that abuse seems to be communicated very easily, but yet how do we communicate healing? So what are some of the facets of trauma? And you will also see this in people who have been brain injured, say in car accidents, serious concussions, other forms of injury. They have a loss of agency. It means I can't do anything. If you can make your own meals, for example, to understand the term agency, you have a sense of agency. I can take care of myself. I can do this. Somebody who's been traumatized has a sense of powerlessness. They can't, it didn't matter what they did. They couldn't protect themselves. This is absolutely key, a foreshortening of future. Somebody, especially in a type B trauma, although this can happen with both forms, but the type B trauma tends to believe it's been bad. This bad thing happened. It's always going to be bad. And that's a foreshortening of future. It's not temporary. And that's why we call this return to joy. Depression, the thing that stands to reason. Pronounced anxiety, hypervigilance. Remember, part of this kind of anxiety is because the worst nightmare happened. And oftentimes they didn't see it coming. Or if it's the case of a type A trauma, then all kinds of behaviors are developed to try to nurture oneself in a very unnurturing environment. There are sleep disturbances, nightmares, insomnia. There's all this biochemical thing that's happening with it as well. And then what's very, very disturbing to people who are traumatized, flashbacks, intrusive thoughts, or daymares. All of a sudden you've got these thoughts. And then one of the things I was working with this woman with, and hope she was able to take advantage of it. We're going to talk more later about how to interrupt the daymares. Negative changes in thinking. This person is not only depressed. Again, think about it. If you've been hit by lightning and people tell you, well, don't worry about it. You're not going to be hit by lightning. You're like, what do you mean? I've had this very worst thing happen to me. What else can happen? So the belief of the person who's traumatized is that more bad stuff is going to happen and the good stuff is for other people. Poor attention span, poor focus. What does that sound like, right? ADHD. Distorted sense of time around the event. And when triggered, we live it as though it's current. The body is literally reacting as though it's happening again, even if it was years ago. There's an avoidance of triggers, events, situations, or people. And this is obviously a coping skill. It's effective in the short term. The body's looking for a place of rest. But remember, these are responses. The intrusive thoughts, the daymares, you can't control them. So obviously a person who's been traumatized is going to do whatever they can do, whether it's consciously or not, to avoid these kinds of things that we just discussed. And there's a strong, strong sense of outsiderness. And this is why you might see it with kids that grew up in addictive or abusive families, hanging out with other kids who've grown up in addictive and abusive families. There's a sense of nobody else understands what we've been through, even if it's been unspoken. Vets in the book, The Body Keeps Score by van der Kolk, he really saw how vets often felt that nobody could understand their experience. And certainly there would be some elements of truth to that, but somebody who's traumatized can certainly understand the loss of agency, right? But there's a sense of, we're the only ones that can do this. Nobody else can understand us. Remember, we talked about being disconnected before. What are some of the physical changes? Lowered immune system, autoimmune disease, cancer. Boy, women who've been in abusive relationships or abusive marriages, especially long-term, have a significantly, I think it's a 9-fold risk increase of breast cancer and autoimmune disease, right? It has to do with what the body is trying to do. It's maladapting. Increased abdominal fat, stress and anxiety, it's cortisol. Increased inflammation, again, the cortisol. Increased risk of heart disease. Muscle tension, so very just tight, which means less mobility, increased risk of injury. And this is, you'll see this, somebody who's been through something really hard, just like, oh my gosh, and then you fell and broke your leg. How did that happen? Right here. Thyroid damage. Thyroid regulates metabolism. Blood sugar issues, again, related to cortisol. Lack of coordination, related to the mental tension. Digestive issues, IBS, Crohn's. And now childhood trauma is now being linked to adult chronic illness. And you saw the rate of child sexual abuse, especially right now, I just have the United States statistics, and child abuse. And we're seeing this play out now. It takes a while for these diseases to show up. They don't show up in absolutely everybody, but they're definitely something to look at. So let's talk about, we've talked about the dark stuff. Let's now talk about moving to joy, shalom, and healing. And what are those? What is joy? It's not happiness. It's relational. In the book of Hebrews, it says about Jesus, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. It wasn't happiness. What was Jesus restoring through his death and resurrection? Relationship with God the Father for us, for the joy, for the relationship set before him. He endured the cross. And another way to describe joy, joy means we are glad to be together. Smiles appear, faces light up. When shared, joy produces strong bonds and loving relationships. Joy is what we search for from the moment we are born, but we often come away empty. What was one of the things we said was a big factor in trauma? Disconnectedness, outsiderness. What is joy? The very opposite of that. It's relationship. It's that strong bonding. Another way to describe joy, those of you that have had children, or you've just had a dear friend, they don't have to do anything. Just being in the room and you haven't seen them, you just, that's joy. When a parent looks at their child, a newborn child, doesn't matter whether it's adopted or whether it's born into the family, what is the look on the parents' faces? It's joy. And what did that child do to deserve it? Nothing. They just are, right? Okay, so does that give you a better word picture of joy? Let's talk about what shalom is. It's a beautiful word. According to Strong's Exhaustive Concordance, and those of you that are not familiar with that, that's a Bible study tool where they put a number on each word in Scripture, then you can look it up to its original Greek or Hebrew. Shalom means completeness, health, soundness, welfare, safety, rest, harmony, peace without agitation or discord. Isn't that beautiful? It is the exact opposite of trauma. Without agitation or discord, it is translated success, and it is used as part of an inspired blessing. Shalom is applicable both to an external peace between two entities into an internal sense of peace within the individual. And that's why, even if you're not a Christian, I wanted to bring you this concept of shalom. It's an absolutely beautiful thing, and it is what God wants for us. I think one of the things that we have in trauma is people feel a strong sense of abandonment by God, because why didn't he stop it? And there's no real good answer that we can give somebody, at least no short answer that makes them say, oh, well, then I understand. But understand this: God wants you to heal, and he wants you to return to joy and experience shalom. All right. So how do we get back to joy? Maybe you've never had it. Maybe you've been in a type A trauma, and the world has always felt mean and harsh and dangerous. So we're going to talk about a way where can be light and joy, and there are hardships still, but you will have increased resiliency to go through them. So what are some basic wellness principles? We're not going to be able to get obviously into everything, because there's lots and lots and lots of books on those things and support groups, and it is a journey. But we're going to touch on things so you kind of have a place to start. Obviously, rest. And I don't mean this, right? Because that's exhaustion. That's not rest. Rest might be sitting on your deck, sitting outside in a park, no mosquitoes. And you're just enjoying the sunshine, or you're just enjoying the day and the sounds of the birds and maybe children laughing, and you're just content. That's what we mean by rest, right? So it's an active sort of restoration. Clean eating. Junk food takes that lowered immune, that inflammation, the belly fat, all those things, and makes them worse. That's part of a physical negative loop that you get into. Exercise. Remember, we talked about the tension and the body and the lack of mobility. And also, not only is there a sense of disconnectedness with others, depending on the type of trauma somebody's been through, they can have a sense of disconnectedness within their physical selves, where sometimes people who cut are trying to feel. All right? So exercise, again, the brain loves exercise. It connects your brain to the rest of your body, and it restores a sense of connection within you. And it also lowers inflammation and does other things, right? So it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. Community. That would be a church. I work with a business where there's a lot of people, and we often get people who've been through something hard, and they come for the community because it's positive and encouraging and affirming. So a healthy community with young and old, weak and strong, working together. All right. And that's where sometimes community service, where you're maybe working and serving others, can actually be a part of your healing. Spiritual life, getting back with the Lord, working with him, seeking out his shalom and his peace, seeking joy, different than happiness, right? So you're seeking positive relationship, and you're nurturing what's called your joy centers within you. Joy is the answer to trauma. Shalom is the answer to trauma. And these are how we start to build those in for ourselves. Obviously, supplementation is key because it delivers a lot of what's needed in a relatively quick way for the body to utilize. And then, of course, proper hydration. And speaking of which, I'm getting some water here. Let's talk about some drug-free therapies. I can't say that 3 times fast. These are wonderful. There's neurofeedback, and does everything work for everybody? No. Some people might find that neurofeedback is just phenomenal because of the way trauma is. Talking through it all the time doesn't always help. Sometimes we just have to help because remember, it was brain injury, not necessarily emotional. And so neurofeedback, some of these other things deal with like the brain physiologically. So neurofeedback is when EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's a way of taking the sting out of the memories. It's not a deadening. It's just, it basically puts them back into the past. You know how you can think of like, maybe doing school exercises, right? Doing school homework, and you don't have a positive or negative emotion with it. He goes, yeah, we did that. We had to do a lot of homework. but you don't have a whole lot of emotion attached to it. That's kind of the goal of EMDR. So when the memory comes in, it doesn't come in with a whole lot of physiological and emotional. It doesn't re-traumatize. EFT, emotional freedom techniques, you can actually learn to do these on your own to some extent, and they can help, and that's like tapping and things like that. Trauma release exercises are phenomenal. You can do some of these things too, even if you've just had kind of a bad, stressful day. You can do the EFT or you can do the TRE. Go online and look up trauma release exercises, look up some videos. A number of people have done them. There are trauma release practitioners out there. I did these on my own. And what is really wonderful about these is they release the tension that we just talked about in your muscles. It's like if you've got some like in your elbow and you didn't know it, the trauma release exercise will find it, and so your elbow will be moving. There is no emotion. It's not bringing up the memory. It's literally just working through your central nervous system. Supplementation we'll talk about. Exercise, the mind-body connection we mentioned. Art, music, and play therapies. Play meaning literally acting out a play. Because again, those are helping the body to reconnect, helping the emotional centers and the executive centers to reconnect. And because of the way the brain will store trauma-based feelings and emotions and memories, you oftentimes have to go through the emotional doors. And music is the intelligence of an emotional soul, right? It relates to the soul, so does art. And so that's why those can be very, very effective. Cognitive therapy, that means talking it through. If you do seek that out, and you may absolutely be a part of your healing journey, do seek someone who has good and been trained experience in trauma. All right. Massage therapy to detoxify the body, to, again, the muscles, fascia, all that stuff. Chiropractic, also very important because of the way when you've got a lot of tension, you hold yourself wrong. And so you're much more likely to become unbalanced. And the other thing about chiropractic, it's going to straighten that out for you. And then acupuncture actually has some benefit in trauma. What about medical interventions such as antidepressants? Those can probably be helpful. And if somebody is absolutely melting down, I'm thinking of somebody who may be maybe perhaps a crime victim. Short term, it might help them get a place. All right, so there certainly may be a use for them. That's certainly a decision between you and your doctor, and maybe somebody who's helping you walk through this. But be aware that they may work in the short term, may not be needed in the long term, especially if you're doing these other holistic things. And some of these do have risk factors for Alzheimer's. So in teens and children, they can actually be paradoxical. What is meant to calm actually excites and enrages. So just be aware of that. But again, they may be needed, especially in acute situations. Let's talk about healing your brain. I love brains. Brains are good. And when we're working together, right? The thing about trauma is it affects everybody in the family. Even if one person is traumatized, just the nature. That's why we're spending so much time this month on mental wellness. You want to increase the neurotransmitters for brain function. You want to reduce the stress hormones because those are bathing the brain, and then the brain's reacting to that again. You want us, so the brain has got higher nutritional needs to begin with. 50% of the glucose that is in your diet is for your brain. And then it has a high need for healthy fats. Trauma is making it work extra hard. And so something that's working extra hard just needs more fuel. It just flat out does. You also want to reduce and eliminate brain toxins. The brain is trying to heal through this. And so you really want to eliminate those things that are toxins. Take the load off, literally. You need to practice affirmations or afformations, which is instead of saying, I am healed, which is okay, it might be better for many people to say, I am being healed, because it admits the progress. Practicing mindfulness techniques. What do we mean by that? One is called grounding. There's a couple of ways to do that. We talked about the disconnectedness, and one of the things that happens in trauma, this is something I had to work through, was disassociation, a sense of being out of your body, a sense of watching and not being connected. So one of the things, especially when somebody is triggered, or having a flashback, they need to ground. And that's something as simple as saying, I see the computer and it's black. You have a white shirt. There's a bookcase behind me. You're literally identifying and discussing out loud things in the room. Now, if you're in a meeting and you can't do that, and you do it quietly to yourself, but you physically make yourself notice things and identify them to yourself. And what you are doing there is you're interrupting the loop that the brain is going into. One of the things is our brain, we are fearfully and wonderfully made, and whatever we think about, we become. And one of the reasons that is our brain literally develops the circuits for it. So when there's trauma and you're stuck in these brain loops, you keep playing the thing over again and again and again. Part of what your brain is trying to do is solve the trauma, fix it, make it better. But it can't. It happened in the past. But the brain doesn't know that. Remember, it doesn't have the sense of time. So it's trying again and again and again. And that's where the daymares and the intrusive thoughts and the insomnia and all that come from, because your brain doesn't distinguish that it's not happening now. So, and I know that I struggled a lot with thoughts of death when I was actively fighting against the PTSD. And so I would have to, when those thoughts would come, I would have to literally start grounding myself. And I would have to start saying out loud or putting praise songs on and singing them. I had to interrupt the loops. All right. Another form of grounding, by the way, is when the people refer to walking outside barefoot, which you can't really do much in the winter up north, but you can do it down south. So going and walking outside, but being in nature, nature is very, very healing. That's why sometimes a lot of these spas and that are not in busy cities. They're out in the country or on the beach or in the mountains. Protecting your environment against stressors. So lots of noise, lots of screens, and this is not when you play the acid hard rock, right? This is where soft music, peaceful music, happy music is going to be. You want to be in community. You might be tempted to isolate. You'll have to fight against that and get into community. It's the kind of thing where you don't want to go, but when you were there, you were very glad to be there. The more that you are in community, the more you're going to, it's much more quick. I don't want to say quick because it could take a year or so, but you're going to heal much more quickly. Sleep as much as you can, rest your brain, and then being out in nature. You also have a second brain. What? We're not going to spend too much time on this, but your gut instinct is real. One of the things in trauma is we learn to distrust our gut. We learn to distrust our instincts. And we can't distinguish, because of the hypervigilance and the increased anxiety, between instinct and fear. So, but your gut instinct is real. And as you heal and return to joy, that instinct will become solidified again. But one of the things your gut does when you're under stress and anxiety is it gets flooded with things, and it kills the good guys, which help make the neurotransmitters, which help make your brain function. So one of the things you want to do is work on gut health, because stress from the trauma destroys the gut biome. So the more you can build that gut health, the more you are giving your brain what it needs to heal physically. And then healing your spirit, remembering that God has not abandoned you. It feels like it does. And if you read in the book of Psalms, David felt abandoned. You read about Elijah, and he was like, I did all that, and now look at me, I'm being chased. So that's a very common feeling. God's not afraid of you having that feeling. Take it to him. He is sovereign, and his judgments are right. Some of them are very hard, but they're right. He does collect your tears in a bottle. The Bible says he's very near the brokenhearted. Why do we need to know that? Because we feel abandoned. But some translations say he's writing your tears on a scroll. He's right there as you are weeping. He desires shalom for you. And if that's the first thing you learn how to believe, that despite everything, he desires that whole peace for you externally and internally. He commands us not to be anxious. You're thinking, well, I've just been there through this thing, and I have no way to calm down. How I understood that scripture is somebody who's in trauma can't just go, well, I guess I'm not anxious. But what that told me was I wanted to obey God in not being anxious. And so perhaps what I could do instead was ask God to then help me that if he commanded me to not be anxious, he would certainly give me the tools to do so. Does that make sense? Do not forsake the assembly of the brothers. That's referring to church and Bible fellowship. Seek to serve where you can, as you can. Don't overwhelm yourself, but wherever you can serve and be a blessing to others, you're being part of that community. And in serving even out of your weakness, you become stronger. Pray for discernment between spiritual and trauma attacks. They may not be the same. Okay, and so they use different tools. Increase your capacity for relationship because trauma isolates. And increase your capacity for joy. And so the more you increase your capacity for relationship, the more you increase your capacity for joy. So there's a few resources that I love, and one is called Life Model. And the thing I like about Life Model is that and they're called Connexus or Thrive, Living from the Heart Christ Gave You. What they are is they're community-based trauma healing using the best of neuroscience, psychology, and faith. So it's really taking the best of those disciplines and bringing them to bear in healing. They're also multi-generational. And one of their beliefs is if trauma can be taught and abuse can be taught almost without teaching it, then so can healing and joy. Isn't that a nice thought? Let's talk about healing your body. You want to get it to a healthy weight, not too thin, not too overweight. And give yourself time on that. Give yourself time. Understand that it's part of your healing. It may not be the first thing that happens, but it's part of your healing. Any kind of exercise, stretching, something called praise moves. Eccentrics is something I really like because it really releases pain. It works all of your muscles. And you can do it regardless of your activity level, whether you haven't exercised in 10 years or you're an elite athlete. But dancing, the nice thing about hiking and sports is they include exercise with community. Massage does release trauma and stress. These trauma release exercises, chiropractic, gut health, immune system health, rest, sleep, limiting activity, knowing your limits, right? Not in compounding anxiety and stress by trying to do 100 things. Talk about supplementation because this enables your body to get at levels of concentrations of things that will help heal your brain that you really can't get from food. You just can't eat the quantities and still fit into those genes, right? Omega fatty acids are important for mood, sadness, brain function. They also reduce inflammation, lower cholesterol, and help balance other hormones. That's a lot. Protein is a critical building block of all cells. It stabilizes blood sugar. It improves immunity, healing, muscle health, and brain function. Vitamin D3 can help with depression and brain function. It's actually a type of hormone, and you'll be seeing a lot more research coming out. The more they learn about the role of vitamin D, the more they tell you to take. Antioxidants. Stress creates, if you think of rust as oxidation. So think of stress creating lots of rust in your body. And so antioxidants actually help combat the rust and protect your cells and protect your immune system and help mop up toxins. They do a whole lot. B complex is like food for your central nervous system. And it helps with hormonal balance because all that cortisol can contribute to an imbalance. It also protects your heart and your immune system, and it reduces stress. So you see, you get a multiple. The beauty of working in a holistic approach with diet and supplementation, these other things we talked about in healing from trauma and returning to joy, is that they work together and increase. Let's talk specifically about cortisol and a word I have a hard time saying called ashwagandha. Ooh, but I did it. You can see here, I'm not going to read all of these, all of the things that it works with. Cortisol does the things on the left. Ashwagandha does the things on the right. Okay, so it really does counteract the negative effects of cortisol. There's also a compound called L-tyrosine. And the benefits in healing from trauma is it prevents decline in cognitive function during stress. Have you ever been stressed out and you can't remember things? That's what that looks like. Increased alertness, not hypervigilance, just being alert. It increases the production of the neurotransmitters, neuro means nerve, of dopamine, which is, addicts are always looking for a dopamine hit, and norepinephrine, which is important in pain relief, natural pain relief. It mitigates the effects of acute stress. It lessens the effect of loud noise. Do you ever notice when you're stressed out, you just can't tolerate noise? Right. It lessens the effects of that. It helps your thyroid produce T3 and T4. And what does cortisol do? Right, it dampens thyroid. You see how these work together? It's been studied by the military for use in combat vets. It's quickly metabolized. They actually use it in treating PKU, which is fetal keto. I'm not going to be able to say it, but it's a defect in a type of metabolism. L-theanine, it's also known as glutamic acid. It actually is derived from tea, but it helps smooth brain waves, make them more calm. So it relaxes and calms your mind, but you don't get drowsy. It helps you achieve a deeper, more restful sleep. It enhances mood by mood balance, helps protect the liver from alcohol, offers protective effects against brain degeneration and possible immune system benefits. So that means it's still being studied. And it's very safe. Look at all these benefits. And we have something called stress relief complex that is actually a combination of the ashwagandha, the tyrosine, and the L-theanine that we talked about. And it helps you cope with stress. I take it at night, and some nights when I'm super wound up, I'll take several. It actually stops that mental spinning, that loop. It increases calmness and yet focus. It's excellent for severe to mild anxiety, depending on the level of anxiety. That's how much you'll take. It works pretty quickly, within about 20 minutes. You take it as needed, but it is not habit forming. It's actually safe enough to give to a child. And it blocks cortisol, and it supports your adrenal glands. How's that for a win, 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 win? You know what they say, hashtag winning. So we turn to joy. Give yourself some time. It will take, depending on the length of trauma, your background, all those variables. But this is a time where you're going to be patient for yourself. This healing is worth it. You will get your life back. You'll get your mojo back. It will come back. I can say that's happened in my life, but give yourself some time. But you will begin to see some benefits and some progress pretty quickly. Your body is very responsive. The whole wellness approach that focuses on the mind, the gut, and reduces stress, being in community, working on your spiritual health, the whole body, whole clean foods, supportive health practitioners. Oftentimes naturopaths are a very, very good source here. Physicians tend to be, the pharmacy oriented, and a naturopath is not going to be so much. And ideally they would work together. And then supplementation is going to be essential because of the demand on the body. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. You can find me on Facebook. But this particular thing is going to be exclusive to our group. And I am not putting this on YouTube. So if you have somebody who needs to see this, please add them to the group. I do personal consultations. We have this huge resource library called the Wellness Project. And we actually have in there Dr. Browse, he's a naturopath, talking on mood and anxiety and gut health. And that's phenomenal. It would be very helpful for this here. And then in our group, we do lots of web events. We love to bring people value and give them the kinds of tools and information they need to be their own best advocate. So I want to thank you so much for joining me tonight. You've been awesome. And I'm going to, again, upload this into the Woman Wise Healthy Living group. It's going to be in the learning units. And again, if we can help you in any way, please feel free to reach out. Good night, everybody.